3, 2, 1, go! Easy right. Easy left. Easy right. Over jump. Easy right. Long medium right. Check point. Easy right. Over jump.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Time Extend, and this is a very exciting one. Joining me, as always, is Brendan Rorison, but Brent, we have a very special guest today.
Absolutely. We have what some arcade racing game fans would call absolute royalty. We have the voice of the co-driver from Sega Rally 1995, Kenneth Ibrahim, here with us. Kenny, it's a pleasure to meet you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity to be interviewed about this. What is it, like almost 30 years since I did this? It's very interesting and should be a lot of fun. So I'm glad to be here.
Speak for ourselves, Adam, and we say we're surprised or maybe the first people to directly quiz you about this, Ken, because everybody knows your voice so well, but they might not know the man behind it.
Yeah. It's interesting because that was in 95. I joined Sega, I think, in 94, and I was there for about a year and a half. But every 10 years or so, something about Sega Rally and my involvement as the voice of it, crops up somewhere. I guess now because, the internet, actually, I first used the internet when I was at Sega. That's when it first came out, it became available to the public. But then with social media, and I'm somewhat active in social media, so I guess people figure this stuff out and they'll end up contacting me. So on average, every 10 years, there's a little resurgence of Sega Rally interest, it seems. And yeah, so it's kind of fun that way. I kind of forget about it until that happens. Like, oh yeah, I did that.
Well, I think our paths crossed initially a couple of years ago because somebody, and I don't know who, unfortunately, but they created this amazing meme, which was like the Homer Simpson Chief Wiggum scene where they're in the car, but they were actually on the desert course from Sega Rally, and your voice was playing as the co-driver. And it was this beautiful moment where all the Sega Rally fans kind of came out of the woodwork, and you were like, "Hey, that's me."
Yeah, that's right. Somebody, in fact, a Japanese acquaintance of mine who were friends on Facebook said, "Hey, you got to check out this video." And so I did, and I, followed that back to the Twitter account, and then posted on there that it was me. So I think, that probably stirred up some interest again as well. But that was a lot of fun. I was like, "Wow, that's my voice in there,"
Yeah,
and I'm Homer, so that was interesting.
How often do fans and stuff reach out to you and they're just like, "Hey, I played the game so long ago, thank you," that kind of thing?
Again, like every 10 years or so, something happens, and then I'll start to read through some of the Twitter comments, and I'll think, wow, this really has had some kind of a real impact on people. So that makes me feel really good. And and then I feel, okay, I'll make some comments in there, and that starts some more feedback and responses. And I have seen people say things like, "Oh, I used to play this with my dad or something," and your voice reminds me of my time with my father. And I'm like, wow, that I'm kind of touched and honored to have done that for people. You don't think about it when you do it, obviously. And of course, I'm a huge fan of science fiction, and I got a lot of people that I met in my life. It's like, oh my God, you get really shy and whatnot to meet these people, but you want to tell them how much their influence has had on yourself and what they've done for you. And I get all choked up when I try to say it. So it's kind of interesting to be in the situation in reverse where I've had that impact on somebody else. I'm really happy that's the case.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, Ken, I got to play Sega Rally for the first time because of my dad, for example. And when I was going through playing racing games through the years and stuff, Sega Rally always stood out to him as the most apparent one. You can remember us playing together, and every time he'll still say a few lines of dialogue that you've said. Like overjump, easy right, maybe, that type of stuff. And And he always says, like, anytime I'm playing a rally game, he'll be like, that's what's missing these days. Like, need that little bit of character in the co-drive. And it's all too cut and dry these days. We need a bit of fun stuff.
Yeah. No, it's great to hear in your case as well. Yeah, it's just great to have been part of that, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, I think back to the fact that, you know, this game is almost as old as I am. I've been playing it almost my entire life. So to be able to sit here today and talk to you, like two huge Sega Rally fans, talk to you about it is a pretty humbling experience. So yeah, again, thank you.
Oh yeah, you're welcome. I mean, it wasn't. It's, you know, lucky circumstance, I guess is a good way to put it. But it's too bad you guys weren't this age at the time we did it. I'm sure if you were in Japan at Sega, we would have had you in and shown you around the department and all that.
Oh, we were fortunate enough to visit the Sega office in the UK a couple of years ago, and even that was a cool experience. But yeah, that was really the heyday, right? And you were there. Yeah, you were there right in the thick of it, in the very influential period.
Yeah, I think actually I was part of a wave of people who had come in. Sega was trying to hire more non-Japanese to kind of, you know, more internationalize the departments they had there, both on the development side and the non-development, you know, marketing and sales side. So I had developed like a network of friends there who were not Japanese as well, mainly Americans, a couple of Brits, and became really good friends with them. So we're still friends today. So it's a great group of people that I'm in contact with maybe monthly or so still. And one of them, his career has been somewhat similar to mine, and we've lived in some of the same areas of the States. And so we've seen a lot more of each other over the course of the years and some of the other people. But I remember there was some kind of a push where they were trying to hire more non-Japanese at the time. So I think I was part of that wave.
Yeah, and I might be backtracking a little bit now, but let's talk about, you know, how that came about, because Sega was, I was just kind of going through your resume, and it seems like it was kind of earlier in your career, and you've had, you know, it's funny because we're here today, you know, talking about Sega Rally, talking about your involvement with it, but you have had an incredible career. You've worked at some pretty big names, all in the realm of computer graphics, entertainment, simulation, that sort of thing. Today you're at Lucasfilm, which is, you know, at their peak of relevancy too. So how did this all come about? You know, was it a desire to make games, movies? How did you get your start?
Well, if you're willing to take the time to listen to it, I've got, you know, I can go over the kind of the origin story of it, so to speak. So basically, when I was a kid, I loved science fiction, and there was a show here. I grew up on the central coast of California, and Channel 2 was one of the main TV stations back in like the late 70s, early 80s. And there was a show on Saturday nights called Creature Features, and it was hosted by a guy named Bob Wilkins. I remember that. So he introduced, there was a lot of horror films, and I didn't tend to watch much of the horror stuff, but he played all the Godzilla movies and all the like Japanese kaiju films. And so that really influenced me. So I kind of fell in love with Godzilla. But it wasn't until he started a second show that was on not Saturday nights, but every weekday. So like when kids got out of school, they would see it. It was called Captain Cosmic. And he had like a cape and a helmet, and he had his trusty companion. It was a robot. This was happening right after Star Wars came out, basically. So he had T2 was the name of his robot. But he also, that series or TV program introduced a lot of Japanese anime and live action series. So they had stuff like Space Giants and Star Blazers and whatnot. But the main one that had a huge influence on me was Ultraman. I loved Ultraman and getting home every day to see what the next episode, what powers he was going to have and what kaiju were going to come out. So I think it was my mom took my brother and I from Monterey, where I am now, or actually the neighboring city of Pacific Grove, but up to San Francisco. It's about a 2-hour drive. And they have a Japantown up there, and they have this Kinokuniya bookstore. And so in the bookstore, they had in the kids section, they had all kinds of Ultraman books. And they were these kind of like, not like magazines, and kind of between magazine and book was like hardcover stuff, all the internal pages. And in one of these books, there was a centerfold that had all the Ultra characters of the time lined up. And so I didn't even realize that Ultraman had a family. And there was a king and the mother and father and all these brothers and cousins and things. And so one of the clerks in the store was kind enough to translate all the names that were written on the centerfold page. And that started my interest to really know, what did the rest of the Japanese text in these books say? Because I just had to know more and more about Ultraman. So my mom had gone to school with some like second and third generation Japanese here. And there was an institution called the JACL, I think Japan American Citizens League. And they had Japanese classes on Saturday mornings. And so my mom said, well, why don't you go try one of these classes and see if you like it, and you can try and learn Japanese. And she thought for sure I'd go once and I wouldn't want to have anything more to do with it, but I ended up sticking with it. So I started like the end of middle school and went through high school. Unfortunately, because nobody in my family spoke Japanese, I wasn't able to practice at home. And so I think more than anything, I got a kind of sound for the language. But it really fostered my interest in it. And so when I went to Santa Clara University to study computer engineering, and when I did that, I had 2 free electives in all 4 years, because for the engineering courses they really stuff it full of classes. But I used those 2 free electives to take the first 2 elementary Japanese classes, and I learned a lot more in those 2 semesters of that than I did in like the 5 years I took the Saturday lessons. But I was really appreciative of that organization. Gave me the basis in it. I then ended up applying to a program called the JET program, stands for Japan Exchange and Teaching Program. And basically they'll send folks from native English-speaking countries like the US, Canada, England, whatnot, Australia, to Japan to help the Japanese teachers of English teach the kids native-sounding English, help them with pronunciation and so forth. So I ended up doing that. I mean, that wasn't my goal in life, but it was an easy way to get my foot in the door. I got accepted, so I went over there to Japan, and they don't tell you where they're going to place you. You just have to agree. If they accept you, then they tell you where you're going to live. So it's not like, oh, I'm going to go to Tokyo. You know, you could be anywhere, right. Some suburb or some boondock area. So they ended up placing me in a kind of good area that was a couple hours north of Tokyo by train, called Gunma Prefecture. And so I spent the first year there teaching English. And what I did was I bought all the rest of the textbooks from the university. They went through all of their courses up to the advanced level. And I basically I had a lot of free time when I was teaching English. I'd sit in the teacher's room and I would go through all these books. And of course, the Japanese teachers would see me and they'd go, oh, he's trying to learn Japanese. They're super helpful. So I got a lot of the basis of Japanese. Again, this is one of my main interests in going to Japan in that first year. And then after that year, back through the university, I was looking for jobs in the computer programming area. So I did get a job through the Career Center at the school for a job that was in Tokyo to program Macintosh software, again, back in the early 90s. So I came back to the States for, it was just under a year because it took them a long time for some reason to switch my visa type. So I was on an instructor visa type for teaching English, and they were changing it to an engineer visa type for programming work. So I don't know why it took them that long. So I was back here for about 10 months. I finally made it back to Japan, and I started a job doing that Macintosh programming. And it was while I was there that they had some other programs that had nothing to do with what I was tasked with that were kind of multimedia type software. So it was like early days of Photoshop and things like that, Premiere, and of course, Macromedia Director. I don't know if you guys are pretty young. I don't know if you remember that, but people would use that. Yeah. So Director was kind of like a multimedia authoring software, and they had their own kind of scripting language called Lingo. So I thought, oh, this is really cool. You can make animated graphics for presentations and stuff like that. So I go there after hours at the company and kind of learn those programs. And then while I was working for them, I ended up dating this girl, and she was a lot of fun. And one weekend, she said her office was moving. I forgot where they were, but they moved to the Shibuya area, which is pretty popular in Tokyo. Yeah. So I had moved to a part of Tokyo at this time. And she said that, I had told her about my huge influence by Ultraman, all that stuff. So the company that made Ultraman, it's called Tsuburaya Productions. You're probably familiar with that. It was the name of the man who started the company. And anyway, so she noticed near her new office that there was a Tsuburaya Eizo. Eizo means image. So it was like some offshoot of that company. So she said, hey, if you want, we can go out there. So I said, oh, yeah, I got to go check this out. So we went on a date, I remember, on a Saturday. And she took me to where this office was. Sure enough, that's what it says up on the sign. And the lights were on. So I think at the time, like, there weren't many people that would work on a weekend in Japan. But the lights were on. So I told her, hey, can you wait here a minute? I'm going to go upstairs and just see if anyone's there. So I went upstairs, knocked on the door. It took a moment. Somebody opens the door. And in my kind of like basic Japanese at the time, I said, I'm a huge Ultraman fan. And the guy's like, oh, come on in.
Wow.
So I went in, he sat me down, brought me some coffee, and we started chatting. And it was awesome. And I, like 30 minutes later, I'm thinking, oh no, my girlfriend's waiting outside. I completely forgot about her. So I remember I went to look through the window. She was still there. So I went back downstairs and told her, just give me a few more minutes. And luckily, she was kind enough to wait for me. But basically, that started a relationship with this guy at Subaraya. And what they were actually looking for, after I told him about everything, all my ideas about Ultraman and whatnot, he said, well, actually, we're looking to start a new series. And it'd be great if you could help us out, kind of review it for us as an American, what you think about it. I think, oh my God, this is great. And anyway, so one of the things they wanted was what would be a good name for the character. And I tried to come up with a bunch of names, but they said it was going to be mainly like a more of a black costume as opposed to the silver and red. Yeah. And he would be able to appear and disappear and things like this, fade in and out and whatnot. So I think the name I came up with was Stella. I thought, that's pretty cool name. In Japanese, it would be Sterusu. And so I don't know, maybe if the sound in Japanese didn't sound that good to him, but they didn't end up going with that name. But the main benefit that came out of that actually was that guy would invite me to different meetings. I mean, imagine here I am. I have nothing to do with that industry at the time. I'm just some random foreign guy who showed up at their office. And now this guy, like every couple of Saturdays or so, says, hey, come on over. We're going to be meeting with these folks. Maybe you'd be interested. And I said, oh, yes, thank you so much. And I'd go in there and I wouldn't say much. But one day, he had me come over and there was two guys that came in. And they were from a company called Build Up at the time. And Build Up, I later discovered, is kind of like a small version of ILM, or Industrial Light and Magic, back here in the States. Mm-hmm. And they made kaiju suits. They made like plastic model kits that were sold. They worked on a bunch of TV commercials. And most importantly, I didn't go into the whole thing about when I was in high school and got into the first computers that came out. And I'd just say a little bit about that. I really wanted to go into doing special effects for film. And I'd build plastic model kits and I'd light them up with fiber optics. That was my thing, like lighting them up. I wasn't very good at painting them. Excuse me. But anyway, then the Young Sherlock Holmes came out, and that kind of like was a light bulb went off in my mind. It's like, hey, that's really cool. That's something called computer graphics. And it's a way to kind of do what I want to do physically, but not have to do it physically and have to have the space to house things and store the models and all this kind of stuff. I can do it all virtually on the computer. So from that point forward, I had in my mind that I wanted to get into computer graphics somehow. So that programming job, kept me in Japan. And then the story I've told so far got me to meet this guy that, worked at the company that made Ultraman. And then this one particular meeting, this guy that had the company Build Up, the most kind of attractive aspect of it for me was that they were doing some computer graphics. Again, this is early days. They had like 3 workstations. And for some reason, this guy took a liking to me while we're having this meeting. And he said, hey, do you have any plans after this meeting? And I said, no, it's like a Saturday. I got nothing to do. He goes, okay, you're coming with us. We're going to go to another meeting. So now imagine I went to this company, met this guy for the first time ever. Now I'm traveling with this guy to another meeting where he's pitching a game, like a video game concept that couples could go into arcades or game centers, as they're called in Japan. And basically would take a picture of each of their faces and it would try to come up with a baby that would kind of look like the two of them. I remember that. And like, he was asking me for like, what do I think? Do I have any ideas about this? While we're talking, like the CEO of some other company that he was thinking about working with and contracting to help them build that. It's like, wow. So I built this relationship with this guy. His name was Okabe-san. And so I ended up like hanging out with him quite a bit. And he was really trying to court me to come work for his company, Build Up, which to me was like, okay, this would be great. I'll go and work at that company. But over the course of time, I really expressed an interest with him to work on the computer graphics stuff. And he said, well, yeah, of course, I'll let you do that. But, we're using those for actual work. And so the only times they're really going to be available, because we have already like 3 CG artists, will be in the middle of the night. That's when the workstations will not be used. So if you want to go in then, you can. I was thinking, oh, okay. And of course, all the manuals were in Japanese for the software they were using. And, I could read Japanese at a basic level, but to get through all the manuals is going to, be more effort for me than in English. And then I could also tell he really wanted to expand his presence throughout Asia, and he wanted my help with English to do that. So it involved a lot of traveling with him in Asia and other things, handling stuff, dealing with English to Japanese and so forth, which at the time really wasn't of that much interest to me. Like now, if I had that kind of opportunity, I think, oh, that sounds fun. I'd probably do it. But at the time, my real focus was on the computer graphics. So his wedding was coming up, and he said, hey, I'd like you to, come to the wedding. I'm inviting you to the wedding, and I'd like you to give a small or short speech, but do it in Japanese. So it's kind of like the token American guy speaking some Japanese at his wedding. So I thought, yeah, that sounds like fun. So I did that. And shortly after I gave the speech, I was approached by these two guys. One's last name was Uryu-san, and the other guy's name was Mizuguchi-san. So this is Tetsuya Mizuguchi. So he's pretty well known in the industry.
Of course.
And so they were both at Sega in AM3 at the time. And so, they started talking to me and asked me where I learned Japanese and all this, and what am I doing? How do I know this guy? What are my interests? All this kind of stuff. He said, hey, you want to come and see Sega? And I'm like, you sure I do? So I don't know how much longer it was, maybe no more than a month. On their invitation, I went over to Sega, and they gave me the tour, and I met the head of the department, Oguchi-san. He was what was called the kacho, which was the section chief. Later on, he became the president of all of Sega. So I had seen him a couple times since then as the president. That's another story. It's kind of funny, but anyway. So they said, would you be interested in working here? And I thought, well, sure. It was kind of time for me to move on from my other programming job anyway. And so I remember it's okay. Well, you'll have to do an interview and whatnot. You have to take a test. There was some kind of a test. I vaguely remember had to do with like pattern recognition and things like that. So I went in there and did all that, and apparently I passed because they made me an offer. But for me, there was no negotiating. It was just like I was being hired as a Japanese would be hired, where basically they'll just show you a sheet of paper that shows you what your salary is and how much it'll be next year and the year after that and so forth. So I had other friends that came in. Apparently they negotiated, but I was too excited to get the job. So that was how I got to Sega, in a long drawn out nutshell. So it was just a great series of events that happened. So all about timing,
That's an incredible story.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's one of these things where, Ken, obviously being humble yourself, you're describing it as just the timings of everything was correct, that sort of thing. But I don't know if bravery is the right word, but just going straight into that studio, knocking the door and being like, oh, I love Ultraman, and then everything going from there, if that isn't a good testament to how important it is to follow your own intuition, what is?
Right, yeah. I mean, I did have a dream of sorts, and I guess I just did what I could to follow it. But I'm a pretty gregarious person, and I socialized quite a bit. I was a lot shyer when I was younger, but as I grew older, I became more and more outgoing. And so I like striking up conversations with people, and it's not too often I feel kind of shy or intimidated to do that kind of a thing. So, and maybe also at the time I was in my early 20s, so I was probably less inhibited in that regard.
Yeah. So, just the whole aspect of being asked to provide a speech at someone's wedding and you don't speak the language as well as they do would horrify me. So that's where my story would have ended. But the fact that you kept pushing through and got these amazing jobs out of it is pretty special. So
I knew I had to get a couple of drinks in there before I did the speech.
Of course. So you end up working at Sega, and was it direct with the AM3 team at that point, or how did your role exactly form?
Yeah, so I did. I got hired specifically to work in that group, but it was in a subgroup within AM3, and in Japanese it was called Joukan Design. So Joukan means kind of like sensibility or feeling, and this was Mizuguchi's department within AM3. So I was specifically hired in that department to do, again, I was coming in as a programmer, and they were working on an amusement park ride that featured Sonic the Hedgehog. And what they wanted to do was, I think at this point I had already been on Star Tours at Disneyland back in Anaheim. And it just reminded me of something very similar to that. So basically, you were going to sit with a number of other people on an elevated platform, and then basically what would happen, you'd watch these visuals in front of you, and it'd be Sonic running ahead of you. And as you're running, you're on this path, and the path would break into two, and you'd have to figure out which way you're going to go. So each adventure could be different because you'd have these different splits along the paths, and based on which direction Sonic goes, you'll see something different. So again, you'd want to go back and back many times to see all the potential outcomes. But so what my role was to write some software that would use I forgot how many people we had, but maybe like 10 people in the group, something like that, and we all sat near each other in classic Japanese style in one room with no separators or anything. But basically everyone had, in this case, they were all the Unix or actually IRIX boxes at the time. These are Silicon graphics machines. So these were very expensive machines, and the software that ran on them was very expensive. But I was going to write some software that would use the network of these machines to let each person pretend like they're one of the people in the ride. And as you're approaching one of these points where it's going to fork, I had it set up so they could use the left and right arrow keys on the keyboard, and you can kind of keep hitting it as many times as you can to indicate which direction you want to go. And the program would tally up the collective, hits on either left or right. And it displayed these two like primitive 3D arrows on the screen, like getting bigger and smaller, until finally you get to the point where the decision is made. And then if it went to the right, then it used an API to send calls to a machine called an abacus, which was popular back in that time. Not really used anymore for video playback. But I could tell it there was a bunch of pre-rendered sequences that were uploaded by our group. We have some people doing all that rendering. It was uploaded to the abacus, and then based on that final tally, it would tell the abacus play back the right side or the left side. And so that was what I was doing initially. And we got to a certain point where that was kind of a fun project to work on, but ultimately Sega said that we're not going to proceed with that project. So then I think it was either at that point that they either started the Rally game, or it had already been started, and then the people that were working on this team kind of got broken out and assigned to that, maybe some of them to Rally and some of them to other stuff. So I got involved with Rally after that point, and the next thing I ended up doing was, again, it was software tool development. But so I was in AM3. Of course, there were AM2. I think it was like 1 to 7 or 8 or something like that. Yeah. The AM amusement departments. Yeah. And they had made they had a contract. It was either with Lockheed Martin or Martin Marietta, one of those two. Yep. And they were going to use their hardware boards as like the motherboards in the game, in the arcade game consoles. So the teams that were working on the graphics for Rally, they would see stuff on their IRIX or Silicon graphics machines. And so one of the things they wanted to be able to do was take all those graphics and be able to preview them on the Silicon graphics machines, but to see what they would look like when they're playing back on the Lockheed Martin hardware. And so I wrote software to do that. So that was actually kind of like what I was technically working on while working on Sega. The whole thing with the voices that we'll get into was something completely separate from what I was actually doing there and hired to do, obviously. And then they also use the same software to kind of pre-visualize stuff on the actual hardware for some of the other games that they're working on and other ones that would come up. I think like that Virtual On game was another one that they used that on. And then they also had some 2D games they were working on. I remember there was one called Puyo Puyo. But it wasn't used for that because that was all 2D graphics. But this was all for the new 3D stuff where you had kind of automated cameras moving about in 3D. And a lot of that kind of technology was also being developed in AM2, where they were just Virtua Fighter had just come out. So the day I started at Sega, I think it came out like within a week after I started there, and they had one of the units down in the lobby. So after the company closed for the day, all these people would just like go down to the first floor and just like crowd in on this one Virtua Fighter game, and they'd have all these competitions just before it came out in the arcade. So that was a lot of fun to do too. But that's actually what I was technically working on in AM3. And then after that, even I ended up working on a program that was like very early on to try to do some form of facial animation. So again, it was all in 3D, and I remember creating like some very simple like line segments that would correlate to the mouth and the eyes mainly, and maybe to the cheekbones. And then you could animate those, and then that would get then applied to a mesh, like for Sonic or something, that would then it would basically through weighted vertices and whatnot, it would move the vertices of the mesh in this case, like the face. So they had me work on other kind of projects. I don't know how far that ever got to be used for anything, but they were kind of like, experimental projects to see what could be done in this burgeoning, arena of computer graphics. So.
Wow. So, yeah, it's funny how the voice aspect of it was completely separate for all these other things, which were like just doing all of these tasks to help Sega with, I mean, as you say, translating from like the Lockheed Martin board to your Silicon Graphics workstations, like that was done mostly for Rally, but then that ended up being used across the company. And yeah, it sounds like it was really a time where like you came in with a certain role, but your talents and anything you wanted to work on, or where people thought like, hey, we can put Ken on this, or any employee, like there was a lot of autonomy. That's what it sounds like anyway.
Yeah, in reality, I don't know how much autonomy there really was, but in my area, there seemed to be, because Japanese are fairly, what's a good word for it? They really follow the marching orders. You don't really move very far outside of the norm. So, but I think in general, a company like Sega, unlike other Japanese companies like that other one I worked at beforehand, I had to wear a suit every day. At Sega, I was dressed like this, and like I've ended up being dressed the rest of my career in visual effects. So there was that. It was somewhat different from a traditional Japanese work culture. So there probably was some of that, what you're mentioning. But that reminds me of something else, and that is that, again, my real kind of intent was to get into Sega and then, be able to do some visual effects of some sort, some computer graphics. I mean, this was before it was being called visual effects. And another like piece of the puzzle was that while I was working at the previous company doing the Macintosh software development, my mother, every once in a while, she would send me like newspaper clippings from the States. And one of them what was an interview with somebody that was at ILM at the time and had done some previs with CG for Jurassic Park, for the raptors and dinosaurs in Jurassic Park. So this is a guy named, his name was Steve Williams. His nickname was Spaz. And actually, I never met him, but he used to work at the company I worked at after Sega. So we both kind of came out of the same company in some fashion. But that was the first time I ever saw in the article it mentioned the name of the computer graphics software that he used to do the dinosaurs. It was called Softimage. And so I kind of forgot to mention that when I met Mizuguchi-san and Uryu-san at the wedding, one of the things they mentioned was that they use a software called Softimage for the graphics. And that's really what made me think, okay, I got to go see this, and I got to try probably to get in there, because this is the software that's being used on the films that I eventually want to get into doing. And so that was another big thing for me. Again, like in my own time, because I had access to that software, and the reason I had access to it is because Sega was at the time the world's largest client of Softimage. So they basically had a site license to use the software. It wasn't node lock in a lot of cases. And the other nice thing about it was, I remember this, I always have this kind of etched into my memory. I wanted to go, I got to get the manuals, because not only do I want to learn how to do the graphics with it, but I want to learn how to use their APIs to do stuff, to develop new tools for it and whatnot. And so I remember going into the hallway, and the hallway, I don't know, it's quite a large floor. There were just stacks and stacks of these blue boxes of like 3 or 4 blue 3-ring binder manual sets for a Softimage. So basically, and in one room they had, I don't know how familiar you are with the Silicon Graphics machines, but there was one that was made at one point. It was a little bit smaller and more streamlined. It was very thin, called the Indy.
Okay. And
it was kind of like a cyanish color, where other machines like the Indigo and other ones were much bigger and bulkier. And they had it was almost like a render farm. You open one room and there were stacks and stacks with no monitors connected, just stacks and stacks of these Indies. It's like the most expensive machines you could imagine at the time, and they just had tons of them all over the place. But anyway, so this wall of manual sets. Oh my God, okay. They're all the original English manuals. And I said, okay, I'm just gonna pick one of these. I remember thinking like, eeny, meeny, miny, mo, whatever, I'll take that one. And so, and the reason they had them all stacked in the hallway, and the reason that the software was so prevalent not only at Sega, but other companies were using, is because there was a retailer in Japan that had taken it upon themselves, or a reseller, actually, I should say, not a retailer, they've taken it upon themselves to translate all the manuals into Japanese. So it made it a lot more accessible for the Japanese to use it, and lent to its popularity and its inroads there. So then again, in my own time, I started playing around, learning how to create like simple polygon models and doing texturing and animating, creating cameras, doing all this kind of stuff. And also, they did have a need to create some tools to do some data extraction from the graphics. There was a few people in our group itself that were dedicated to doing the graphics. They already had some years of experience creating the CG, and now with the Softimage software. So I was helping them to create tools to export stuff that they had created and various kind of tools for that, purposes like that. And but after they saw me do a certain amount of stuff, then they said, well, okay, maybe you can help us do some of the graphics for some of the TV commercials. And more than the TV commercials, they were opening an amusement park, or a set of amusement parks called Joypolis.
Yes.
And this was at the beginning. They hadn't been open yet. They were just starting. I remember even they had a logo design contest for the employees of the company. I remember being there on a weekend with another friend of mine brainstorming on logos, and I submitted at least one. The other guy submitted a few. Ours didn't get selected, but it was fun to submit that anyway. But for each of the rides, they would have like the instructions and the warnings, all that kind of stuff. So when people are waiting in line for the ride, there'd be a TV monitor and be playing back these graphics. So I remember I did some of the graphics for some of those presentations that would just play on loop. So that was great. So that was I finally got to get my hands on computer graphics software and actually made some stuff. And because we had that Abacus and whatnot, I was able to take what I rendered, move it onto there, and from there I could get it onto videotape. And even like DAT tape at the time is what we used for backup. So I still have all these DAT tapes now that it's very difficult to use. Luckily, Lucasfilm has a room full of these tapes as well. And they said, yeah, maybe on an off hours, you could use it to get your data back off. But yeah, so that was another huge component of it for me, was the access to this software called Softimage, which was actually being used in Hollywood at ILM on the movies that I want to end up working on. And they just had so many copies of it at the office. And not only that, but I don't know, maybe half a year or so after I started at Sega, or maybe even a year or so, they had a group of people come over from Softimage in Montreal to do some dedicated software development. And one of those guys was one of the founders of the company. And he was a little bit rough around the edges to start, and it took a while to kind of break him in. And I remember one of the other guys that I really quickly became good friends with, he's like, oh, I'm so sorry. But after a little bit of time, he kind of opened up, and then we were good, all of us. But it was really fun hanging out with those guys, because they didn't speak any Japanese. We were kind of helping myself and a couple other friends that were already at Sega, and we go out to dinners together, and on the weekends get together and do stuff. And they taught me a lot, on the programming side and whatnot, because these were like the core programmers at that company. And it ended up that I think they were there for about somewhere between 3 and 5 months, maybe something like that. And the efforts of all their work ended up being, I think, turned into another module for the Softimage 3D product, because they had a bunch, like at the top of the screen, you could click and switch between the screens to have like different dedicated tools. And so they ended up adding to that one called the games module, I think, but it was all based on work they were doing while they were kind of in-house there at Sega.
Wow. Yeah, it's interesting how at this time, ILM has come up a lot in this, and amusement parks and rides and things like this. It was all sort of connected. I talked to an individual once who actually started on, he had worked on Star Tours and ended up working for Martin Marietta, and then out of that came the whole contract with Sega, and knew Yu Suzuki very well. And it's just funny how it's this just like out of sort of this this environment of just creating new forms of entertainment and stuff, video games, all comes from because even that Martin Marietta technology goes back to sort of aerospace simulations and stuff like that. It's a fascinating history. Yeah.
It was interesting how it kind of all came together there. But it's funny you mentioned Yu Suzuki, because he was the head of AM2, as opposed to AM3. And this other really good friend of mine named Jeff, who I'll tell you a little bit more about when we get to the actual voice discussion. But I just mentioned the guys from Softimage. So the lead, one of the co-founders of it, his name was Laurent, and he had bought some samurai armor while he was there, and he wanted to take a picture of it, but he was it was a little bit too small for him to fit into. I mean, he wasn't like a big guy or something, but just the armor is a little bit too small for him. So it fit me, and he said, "Hey, can you wear the armor so I can take a picture of it?" And I said, "Sure, I'll do that." And so I remember doing that, but then because he was also helping out, I guess, AM2 a little bit or something. But anyway, and this other friend of mine, Jeff, he knew Yu Suzuki much better because he was working on the Virtual Fighter stuff with him. And anyway, so we ended up taking a picture where he also bought a sword, the samurai sword. And so I have the whole armor on and the sword, and I sneak up behind Yu Suzuki. And I think my friend Jeff probably he used to make animal sounds to scare the crap out of people around. He'd sneak up on them in the company, do that. And I can't make those kind of sounds, but he's really good at that. He'd scare the crap out of them. They jump, So he did that, and Yu Suzuki kind of turned around, but I think he didn't jump as much. But then he kind of just had a big smile on his face, and we got the shot. So there's this picture of me like this with the sword near the neck of Yu Suzuki.
That's amazing.
That's an incredible picture. Yeah, hang that up on the wall.
Yeah, maybe I could find it and share it with you guys later.
Yeah, that'd be really cool. There's actually a point I was going to bring up, Ken. Obviously, you talked a bit about Star Tours and all that side of things. In your production history, I can see that you got a special thanks credit on Star Wars Arcade as well.
Oh, yeah. I
think it's maybe a good point to perhaps bring that up, maybe a little bit of story about what that was actually for specifically, because sometimes those credits can be a bit vague, and I'm sure there's some people out there that probably find it interesting why your name would be in there as well.
Yeah, I had completely forgotten about that. But again, I think when that Homer video came up and whatnot, I started kind of getting interested in the whole Sega history again. So I started looking around, and there's one or two different websites that kind of chronicle all the credits for people that are in Sega that had worked there. And I found also these other friends of mine. I looked their names up. Sure enough, they're credited in there. And I had looked at my name and I said, "Oh yeah, Rally." I'm like, "Oh, Star Wars." I completely forgot about that. And yeah, that I was in the special thanks. And then I forgot that they had even mentioned me in the game. And I thought that is bizarre, because my whole point, or the whole kind of journey of my career, I was trying to eventually work at ILM, which I still haven't actually technically worked at ILM. Even now I'm at Lucasfilm Animation, but we're kind of sisters companies in the same buildings.
Yeah.
But I did, as you can see in the back here, I did work on episode 7, Force Awakens. And I thought, I finally got my name in a Star Wars movie, or at least in the Star Wars franchise. And then when I saw that thing, I said, "Oh, that is so weird." I actually got my original Star Wars related credit all the way back at the time that I worked at Sega. But basically, when I first started there, they were already working on this Star Wars game, and I think it was like a Death Star Trench type of game where you're flying an X-wing.
Yeah.
And I can clearly see that the face of the guy who was the head of that project. I cannot remember his name. I remember he had glasses. He was very excitable and a fun guy to chat with. But I think they gave me the credit in there because they needed help with communicating with Lucasfilm at the time in English. And so I think I ended up, helping to facilitate that, and probably wrote some emails or letters or whatever it was at the time, and helped translate some stuff for them. And I remember that guy who was the lead on the project, and one or two other people that were working on it, they were going to fly them out for a meeting at Lucasfilm. And I remember trying to convince them, "Is there any way I can go with you?"
Oh, wow.
Because that was my dream, was to get there,
Yeah,
it didn't work out. They didn't send me, but yeah,
you got there eventually.
I got there eventually, yeah. But that was my involvement. That was probably why I was given that credit, which I had completely forgotten about until more recently.
Yeah, that's pretty funny then. So you actually achieved one of your goals way earlier and ahead of schedule than you would have imagined at the time.
Yeah. The other thing I remember now, at some point while I was living in Japan, I was there for 6 years in total in the 90s. And at some point in the early part of that, probably before I got to Sega even, and maybe it was while I was teaching English, I went to a movie theater and watched, it was like some movie based on Gundam or something, probably, I think it was Gundam, maybe something like that. Anyway, there was a part in there where the music sounded a lot like the Imperial March, and I thought, wow, that cannot be coincidence. Somebody's basically copying the Imperial March here. And so somehow I figured, I'm gonna let Lucasfilm know about this. And I forgot if I wrote them a letter or what, but I must have been a letter or maybe an email by that point. I can't remember. But anyway, they actually got back to me, like really thanking me for letting them know about that. I have no idea whatever came of that, but and who knows what happened to that composer? Probably nothing. But anyway, that I remember that was another point at which I had made some form of contact with Lucasfilm.
Interesting. So along the way to where you ultimately ended up, there were always those little seeds of engagement, and it's crazy to see that actually. And it's funny. So the special thanks credit, then, did you actually know it was in the game before this wiki, or was it like when you found like one of these Wikipedia entries?
I probably knew about it at the time. I probably saw it or they showed it to me, but I had just completely forgotten about it. I completely forgot there was a Star Wars game being worked on in AM3 even until relatively recently. That looking at that website reminded me of it.
Well, it was interesting because that one was exclusive to arcades, I believe, and then eventually there were a bunch of Star Wars games happening on PC, and there were a couple on N64, and then had a big resurgence when Episode 1 came out and stuff. But I've seen that cabinet in the wild from time to time. You don't come across it very often, obviously, anymore, but it was a pretty striking machine. Yeah. Yeah,
when I worked there at AM3, I mean, they only worked on the big arcade games. They weren't working on Saturn or Dreamcast or any of that stuff, whatever existed at the time. Because I know they did port like Rally and other games to the home game system. When it came out.
From what I understand, the way it usually worked was you had AM2 or AM3 working on the arcade original title, the source material, and then you would maybe have AM4 or AM Annex was, I think, one of the studios that would deal with the, bringing that to Saturn or whatever. But you would probably know better than I would.
Yeah, not really. But I think Annex was what Mizuguchi-san went on to make after AM3 before he made his own companies. Yeah.
So a lot of things moving around, and in the middle of all of this, you're asked to provide the voice for a co-driver in the racing game. So how did that happen?
Yeah. Again, I can't. I'm a little fuzzy on all the details, but basically, there came a point where they needed to record the dialogue or the lines for the game, and they needed somebody to do the voice of the navigator. And so I forgot if they just asked people who spoke English natively if they just went around all of us, but somehow they let us know that if you're interested, come down to the sound department and we'll record the lines. So of course I was interested to do it. And I think originally it was meant to be more as a temporary voices, because I think they were going to hire actual voice talent to do the real ones. And myself, I did it. And a friend of mine, Jeff, I remember he recorded lines. I can't remember how many other native English speakers there recorded as well. But I remember them letting me know that they were actually going to use my voice as the game. And I thought, wow, really? And I thought, wow, that's pretty cool. So not only that, but then they had to populate like people standing, like, spectators watching the race. And so they took all the people in our department. We went up to the roof of the building. This was the old Sega headquarters in Japan. We went up to the roof and they took pictures of us. And I remember I had a striped shirt on. And so they took all the pictures. And so all the people from the department, or a number of them, are the ones that are all standing on the sides on on 2D cards, I think, in the game.
Yeah. Wow.
So, and I think we do something like this or whatever. I forget now. But,
I'm going to look for you
absolutely
after this. Find you.
Yeah, I think I had a striped shirt. But yeah, so it ended up, they let me know that they were going to use my voice for it. And I couldn't help but think, well, that's great. This is awesome. I never imagined this happening, but I was just wondering how much you had to do with the fact, well, you know what? That's kind of good enough. And then we don't have to spend money on an actual voice talent because we're already paying him as a regular employee. So who knows what the thinking was behind it? But so I do all the voices in the game, including when the game is idling and it announces the name of the game. But there is one line that's done by that friend of mine, Jeff, and it's the one in the beginning when you first start the game, and it's the countdown, 3, 2, 1, go. That's actually my friend Jeff, and the rest of it is me.
Yeah.
So
that's interesting. I never think it was a different voice.
Yeah, so that actually brings up. I have a couple questions, because in the Saturn version there were little sort of voiceover interludes, like before replays and stuff like that. Like some of them are pretty funny. Like one of them's a guy saying like, "Who taught you how to drive?" That's not you, I take it.
Not that I remember. No.
Okay. It's funny because the voices they're all a little bit different, but then the sound quality back then was so grainy that's like, well, it could have all been done by one person. I don't know.
Yeah, it seems to me they had us do a bunch of outtakes of stuff, but again, I'm a bit fuzzy on the memory of it. So it could have been one of those, and it could have been one of those that that friend of mine Jeff recorded, or one of the other people that were there recorded. And I don't know how much after after Rally came out that was done or released. So they may have had other people after that. And so I mentioned I lived in Japan for 6 years, and after Sega, I ended up leaving and going to work for a company that was the main competition for that Softimage company. So it was another company that developed 3D graphics animation software, animation rendering software called Alias. And so I ended up working there for another year and a half. And at that point, I decided to return to the States. And so before I returned, I wanted to kind of go and do the rounds and see everybody that I was friends with and whatnot. And I hadn't seen Mizuguchi-san for a little while at that point. But I made plans to go back to Sega and see him there. And he said, like, you're going back to the States? He said, we decided we're going to make a Rally 2 game, and we were going to approach you to see if you'd be willing to do the voice for Rally 2. And I said, oh, that'd be awesome, but when are you doing that? He goes, well, not until it was some amount of time after I had already made plans to return. So unfortunately, I didn't get to do the voice for that one or any subsequent games.
So that's interesting, because one of the key things I was always curious about was if you were approached perhaps to do Sega Rally 2, and it's great to hear that you did get approached, because like we were talking about at the very start of the podcast, I feel as if the audio design is so key to what makes Sega Rally good. So when that co-driver was changed, I think I wouldn't be overstating it by saying immediately everybody would have been a bit jarred, like, whoa, who's this guy?
Well, that's nice to hear. Yeah, just different. I'm sure certain people started with that game when that's what they knew. So it's funny. It's like when I talk to people about Star Wars, I was 9 years old when the first movie came out. So I was kind of there in the theaters as a kid. And now we have people working at Lucasfilm that are probably half my age, and like they started with Attack of the Clones was like the first film they saw in the theater. I'm like, that is so strange. That's their favorite film in the series, because that's the first one they saw in the theater.
Sure. And
they may have seen others at home, at this point. Well, probably on maybe DVD at that point before streaming became popular. But it's interesting how I work with people, even less than half my age at this point. That for them, Star Wars is the Clone Wars animated series. That's really the core of Star Wars for them, because that's where they started. And then they're in the department. Like, our department is headed by Dave Filoni, and so he was the creator of the Clone Wars series and Rebels and other things that the department has worked on. And so they were huge fans of his, and now they're working for him. So it's kind of fun. It'd be like me working for George Lucas,
The culture is cyclical.
Who's out of the picture at this point, I guess.
So wow. So just going back, like Mizuguchi, so you had moved on from Sega, but he still went out of his way to see if you'd be interested in recording for the second game, even though you were no longer at the company. Or would this have brought you back to the company?
No, it was just a been to record the lines, I think. Because he already knew I was pretty happy with what I was doing after that. And I think by that point, I don't know, probably in his own mind, he was making plans to move on or make his own department or something. But he didn't necessarily come find me. It just so happens that I went to say, hey, kind of goodbye, I'm going to end up leaving Japan. At which point he told me that they were going to come and ask me to do that. But unfortunately, the timing didn't work out.
Yeah, going through your other credits, I see you also contributed to Manx TT Superbike, which is another great racing game. I mean, that's what a Moby game says anyway. I don't know. You can confirm that.
Yeah, that one. I honestly don't even remember about that. I remember them working on it, but I don't remember if I ended up contributing anything to it. The other main one I did contribute to was the Virtua Cop game. That's the main other one. And that one was kind of, because that was AM2. So I guess because of the success of Rally, they said, oh, maybe we can get the same guy to do a voice for us in the AM2 game. And so the main thing I remember about that, I played the voice of the innocent. So there were these people, they were just white, and they were going like this, help me, don't shoot me, this kind of stuff. So that was me doing it. Some very simple lines. But the thing about it, just like when Rally came out, like the kind of pinnacle of all of that was just like in the first few days of the release, if you went to an arcade, because it's the new game, they would have, 10, 15 of them all lined up next to each other as the new release. And it seems to me they were all synchronized somehow, that when they're idling and they say stuff, when people are playing them, basically it was just a real surreal experience to hear my own voice. And especially with the I think it was with Virtua Cop that had come out sometime around Halloween. And I remember being with another American friend of mine from Sega. We were out, and I think it was in the Roppongi area. We were going to have a nice night of fun. And before we got started, as soon as we got out of the station there, we were going to eat something first and then go have some drinks. But we went to the Sega arcade. And I remember, because it was something to do with Halloween, because we went into the bathrooms in the arcade to put on some costumes. I think I was Dracula or something, so I just put on a cape and some makeup or whatever. But I remember going up the escalator to get the second story, and that's where they had all the Virtual Cop games, and I could just hear myself at like top volume. I was like, this is so surreal, you know? Here I come in for Halloween to change, and I'm just hearing like this whole collection of
hearing
games.
your voice. Yeah.
Yeah. I specifically remember because I try to tell myself, remember this point in your life. Yeah, it'll probably never happen again, you know? I used to do that. I think just try and remember this moment, whatever it was, you know, like being alone in the rain in Japan somewhere or something else like this. Is like, this is a moment in life. You know?
Yeah.
Does it get harder when there are so many moments?
There have been a number of moments now, and I kind of stopped doing that. But I just remember I told myself I need to be able to remember these particular things, you know.
Sure.
Yeah.
And those were some of them. Other things were, you know, I don't know, with the girlfriend or the last time I'd go through a station or something like that. You know.
When was the just out of curiosity? Do you make trips to Japan? I know in recent years it's been tough, obviously, with everything going on to the world. But have you been back at all?
Yeah, so I came back to the States in '97, and I would go back on average every couple of years to visit friends there. I think the first time I went back was only a year after, and it was for a friend's wedding, and that was a lot of fun. And that was from another guy from Sega. He was actually he was Chinese Japanese. It was interesting. So he only spoke Japanese. He spoke some English too, kind of rough, but still he loved American culture and music and all that. But he didn't speak any Chinese. But anyway, he went back to his wedding. And then every couple of years after, I go back and visit friends. And then the number of years between got longer and longer until I eventually ran out of miles on the airlines, and I just kind of stopped going. But after Sega, when I went to work for this other company, it was called Alias Wavefront. And I don't know if you're familiar with that name so Softimage was like the premier animation software at the time. But this company, Alias, they had a product called Power Animator, which was it was the competition, and they're trying to get that more prevalent. So they tried to help me to get Sega to buy some licenses of that and to start using that, because it had some features that Softimage didn't have. One of the main ones that was a lot of interest to me was particles. And eventually I went into doing effects animation in VFX, and that's all like particle simulations and stuff. So they gave me, I kind of befriended the person who was the rep from that company, the kind of sales engineer. And he gave me some free copies to use and try to get other people interested. I ended up creating some little demos and got them interested. I think they did buy a few licenses of it. And then that guy said, hey, he wanted to meet me for dinner somewhere in Tokyo. So I went to meet him, and basically said, hey, would you come join us? We're trying to expand the office and presence here in Asia. And so, again, it was about the right time for me to leave Sega. And then I could negotiate my salary and do other things we would normally do with Western companies. Yeah. And so I left Sega to go and do that. And then had a great time there. Got involved in a lot of business travel, which was fun, all throughout Asia, and then back to North America, like monthly almost. The head company was Silicon Graphics. They had bought two companies, Alias and Wavefront. They were both making kind of competitive products, and they merged them. So I joined right at the time that they merged. And so the headquarters of SGI, or Silicon Graphics, was in Mountain View, California. So we'd come back there, like I said, almost monthly. And then the headquarters of Alias, which was kind of the headquarters of Alias Wavefront, the subsidiary, was in Toronto. So then I'd go to Toronto quite often as well. And we do like worldwide field meetings, which are a lot of fun. They give us all these trainings. So they created the software Maya, which has kind of since been one of the premier animation packages. So I joined them when Maya was in beta, and they were training us on how to use it, how to demo it. I became an application engineer, was their term for it. So I was a kind of a demo jockey for Maya and Power Animator before that. But that was a lot of fun too. but I forgot what my original point was. Kind of funny, you start remembering all these things and get off on these tangents. But it was through Alias Wavefront that I eventually returned to the States in '97. They basically treated me as an expat, and based on a few things, including a situation with a girlfriend that didn't work out in the end, and the fact that I needed to get back to the States eventually to get my financial situations, properly started, because that didn't work the same way in Japan. And wanting to pursue this career in visual effects, I decided, okay, now's the time. They had an opening, and actually this is kind of games related. So I ended up, while I was in Japan working for Alias Wavefront, the predominant industry was the games industry. So almost all the demos we were doing were primarily for games companies. And then some companies doing TV commercials, really, but not really any major company. There was nothing really like ILM or Rhythm and Hues, that kind of thing there. So an opening came up in the San Francisco field office of Alias Wavefront. And when we had our worldwide field meeting, I learned about that opening. And so I talked to the head of that office, and he said, hey, yeah, it'd be great to have you if you wanted to, take the job. It's a lot easier for us to hire you, especially with your experience having worked in the games field in Japan, to fill a games related application engineering position back in San Francisco. Then for us to go and have to go through the whole hiring and interview process for external applicants. So I did that. It was basically, it was just like very easy for me to jump into that. So I made the decision to come back to the States. And the funny thing was, I remember the guy who had the role before me, who ended up leaving, was named Rob Titus. I don't know if you've heard that name before. He worked at, he left to go work at Naughty Dog.
Oh,
and so that's where I first heard of Naughty Dog. So this is back again, '97. And so basically he left, and within a couple of months, I just ended up moving into that position. And so in the Alias office, they had 3 application engineers, and the 3 of us are in pretty good friends since then as well, especially one of the 2 I see a lot more often, because the third one went back to Brazil. But I was the games AE, application engineer, and then the other friend of mine was for film and video, and the third guy from Brazil covered industrial design, because the core software product, they had another version of it. They had Maya for entertainment, and they had something called Studio for industrial design, but it used all the original NURBS technology for all these products.
Just out of curiosity, when you were recording the dialogue, because you said that you didn't know, they were just kind of doing it as a test for the go, and then it ended up being what was in the final game. Was there any sort of direction, like play it up or beat, or was it just like you just did a one take? Because
again, it's hard to remember all the details, but I'm pretty sure that they wanted like more and more like energy in it. Because when I talk normally, I'm not talking like this, and I'm not talking at that top of my voice. And it was, I think I had to do a few takes of things that they wanted more and more energy into it.
Gotcha.
I seem to remember that.
It's pretty energetic.
Just because that's not the way I normally speak. So, and it's kind of funny because when I have gone back to listen based on these things that have come up, I think, wow, my voice sounds really high. So I don't know, it's just that was in my 20s versus now I'm in my mid 50s. How much your voice changes over the years. But
yeah, I was gonna say you do sound a little bit different, but it has been 30 years, and also they were telling you to sound like you were going through the air at 70 miles per hour. So it's not the way that anyone usually talks.
Nope.
Kenner, do you remember any of the lines pretty vividly? Like, is there any specific lines that for some reason stand out in your head, or did you have to listen to them all again to get a vibe for it?
Yeah, I didn't remember all the things I had said, but I mean, the easiest one I remember is when I say, finish at the end of the thing, because that was kind of like, all right, you did it. So that's the shortest, easiest one I remember. I remember there's a lot of ones I had to say, which had left and right and maybe, and I was thinking, is that the way these navigators, that's what they say? And I guess they researched it, and that must be it. I have no background in rally racing myself, so.
Yeah. I mean, the funny thing is, I always remember, like, there was genuine discussions, like, between family members and stuff, between if you were saying baby or maybe. So it was like people really thought that you might have been saying baby for that energy part you're talking about, like easy left.
Oh, right.
Like that sort of thing.
Yeah. I don't know if a navigator would tell the driver baby, unless they got a thing going for each other.
I think it's like just because of the kind of that 90s energy to the game and the kind of the very jazzy music and stuff. It was it appeared to be a common misconception, Adam. I don't know if maybe you would encounter similar stuff as well.
I hadn't thought of that because I knew the original word, but I can see, because even like, when you listen to music and you hear lyrics, sometimes it sounds to you like they're saying something completely different. And you've thought that for so many years, and all of a sudden you see it in like a karaoke or something, like, what? I didn't know they were saying that.
Yeah, I remember the one, I might have thought it was baby, but I remember when I was a kid, the one that always stuck in my head is when you would go the wrong way and you'd say, turn around. And it was very, it was very alarming. And then I just picture like, was there ever a moment, I'm assuming not because it would have come up, but you were in an arcade and somebody was playing Sega Rally and you just said, turn around, and you were there.
No, but I do remember this one thing that was, for me, it was interesting because I just briefly hinted, I was in this pretty serious relationship for the last 3 years that I was in Japan. So about half the time I was there. And in the beginning of that time, she was dating another guy already, and then I met her, and eventually things happened, and then things were being tapered off with her previous boyfriend. But it was funny that she told me at one point that because this was right around the time I was doing the rally stuff that I met her, and I told her that I did the voice for this is what I'm working on, actually my voice name. She goes, oh no, she goes, her boyfriend loved the game, and so I'm sure so I can just imagine if he were there and I said turn around.
Oh no!
Walk away. Don't turn around. Walk away and don't turn around.
Voice will never run here. That's amazing.
Yeah. But that something you mentioned a moment ago reminded me that one of the other things that was really cool that came out of the rally game experience was that it did become popular enough that they wanted to release an album of the music from the game. And I don't remember the name of the group. Maybe you guys have researched, maybe you know it, but there was some kind of somewhat popular rock band at the time. I remember Mizuguchi-san was telling me that they were pretty well known, and they were going to hire them to redo all the main music pieces from the game. But they were going to make a new kind of title track song, and they needed lyrics for it. And would I be willing to write the lyrics for that?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
So of course I was like more than happy to do that. So it seems to me he mentioned this like toward the end of a week, because I remember he said, spend the weekend doing it and come meet me at the company like Sunday, like late afternoon or something to go over it. And so I think I spent all of that Saturday and Sunday before going in to see him. And I thought, I don't remember all the lines I wrote, but I thought to myself, I did a pretty good job because there were going to be so many verses and then had to come up with the chorus. So I really spent time trying to, formulate words. He gave me, maybe there's a few words I could try to incorporate into it, something like that. And so I was really proud of what I did. But, for myself, having lived in Japan, you know about Janglish, Japanese usage of English.
Yeah.
All popular Japanese music had some amount of English in it. It probably still does, but at the time I lived, there's always at least a word or something. And, it rarely ever made sense. And even for like names of things on labels and for packaging and whatnot, but mainly in music, you think, okay, it has something to do with the song, but like it never really made any sense. So anyway, so I thought I'd done a really good job of this. I went in to meet Mizuguchi-san, and so he starts reviewing it, and we're talking about it. He's like, well, Japanese won't understand this. Can we change this? And I said, well, okay. And by the time we spent like a couple of hours going through it until he was finally really happy with it and thought this is something that could sell or whatever. I remember looking at it reading like, okay, now I know what happened, Yeah.
That's so interesting. Because I had actually seen that you would come up on some website I looked at as a credit for, I believe the song you're talking about, right, is My Dear Friend Rally. I think is the name of it. Yeah. the lyrics to that song always struck me as odd, but not in an especially unusual way for video games in the 90s.
Yeah.
Lots of which were developed in Japan by people who weren't native English speakers. It's whatever. It's a good song. But this does explain so much. I would love to know what the original lyrics were, but
same.
I you know, it's too bad I didn't save, this would have been all written on paper at the time.
Sure.
And, who knows whatever happened to that. But somebody did ask me online, like, kind of like what you were saying, Brendan, about thinking I had said baby instead of maybe. Somebody else said, I always thought you were saying this. I never knew exactly what they were saying. But I thought to myself, well, you know what? I'm pretty sure I got a copy of the CD, and I think it had the lyrics on it, the ones that they actually used in the end. And so, again, it was all in kind of storage because I've moved so many times. And so I found it. And the other thing I remember was that Mizuguchi actually gave me a credit on the CD, which was nice. I had forgotten about that as well. But they said, I actually went just in preparation for this. I went to pull up because I took that picture. I still have it. So hold on, let me bring it up here. So so the line was, do you feel the heartbeat of the land is the main line. Yeah. And then and to them, it was like, feel the heartbeat of the sand or something like that, I think is what they thought I was saying. So I think once I found that, I remember I posted that for them, and I think that they appreciated that, so they could figure out what the actual lyrics were.
And I'd seen you're a musician too, as well, right? So were you working on musical projects at the time? Okay. But...
No. For me, it's just a hobby. I have actually made a little bit of money on it a few times when people have hired me to do some stuff. Like, I don't perform live or anything. It's just like a small MIDI home studio. But I used to visit the guys in the what was it called? Like the sound department, I guess is what they called it, where they did all the music and sound effects and stuff. And that was great because I was really interested in that too. I still am. So anytime a company has a department like that, I always befriend those people and go and chat with them and talk about synths and drum machines and, virtual software synths and all that kind of stuff now. But it also reminded me, and when I was doing some research for this interview today, I was spending some time yesterday on it, and I remembered, there was a guy named David Lightsey. He was another American that worked in the sound department there. And I don't think he worked on Rally, but I think he was part of that B-Univ, like music group. It was he and a couple of other people from the company. So I don't know if you've heard of David's name or not. But anyway, so he and I became friends. We'd go out every once in a while and have some drinks and chat music and whatnot. But he did me this great favor, and that was that I think I told him that I'm going to be heading back to the States. He goes, all right, anytime you want to buy music gear, you talk to my friend Tom Merritt. You give him a call. Here's his number. He's like in Wisconsin. Best prices, no taxes, and blah, blah, blah. He'll always get what you need. He's always treated me well over the years. So, I've been back for what was it, like 25 years or something? All the gear I've ever bought and some software as well has been through Tom. And that guy recently retired, so now there's his replacement. I'm actually just recently had a back and forth because now that I'm moving back into my childhood home, I'm making the den room in the front. I'm going to turn it into my office, because we're mainly still working from home. But I'm going to set up and buy a nice desk that also accommodates like music production stuff. So like for the keyboard, here's only a 61 key, but I might get an 88 key MIDI controller. And then they have like the tray that'll come out. You can put that in there and pull it out to play and whatnot. Like I've never had that kind of a really nice setup. And now, like this is the time in life I got to spend some money and really treat myself to something.
There was a question that actually popped into my head just when we were discussing that there, Ken. You may or may not be familiar with the fact that the game over screen in Sega Rally is like infamous for being like heralded as one of the best game over screens ever. It's there's a chorus that says like game over, yeah.
Okay.
I don't suppose you know who did the dialogue for that, perhaps. So it's literally a 3-second clip. I always had a feeling it wasn't yourself. And I'm not sure if you actually know anyway who it is, but I've never actually been able to track down who the vocalist was for that.
Huh. No, I don't know, yeah.
Yeah, it almost sounds like actually it might have been Mitsuyoshi. It might have been Takenobu Mitsuyoshi. He didn't do a lot of stuff outside AM2 to my knowledge, but every now and then, because he was just so active in like just Sega, audio all over the place, right? So I believe it was him, but I might not be correct about that.
Yeah. I remember chatting with a lot of people in the sound department, but I mainly hit it off with David, and I actually while I was doing this research, I was trying to remember how to spell his last name, so I looked him up online. I think I finally found him because he told me he used to be an editor at Keyboard Magazine, which I used to collect and read before I moved to Japan. So I was pretty impressed by that. And but I ended up sending him a message and say, hey, you know, after all these years, I'm going to be on this interview, and it kind of reminded me of all this stuff. I remembered, you know, hanging out with you and whatnot. So I reached out to him online, sent him an invite, and whatnot. So we'll see if he responds to that. It's been so long, you know, I don't know if he remembers who I am or not, but
yeah. It's cool. It sounds like you keep in touch with a lot of these people, and everybody, you know, it's been so long. Everybody's careers have gone in all sorts of different directions, but that is genuinely great to hear.
Yeah, I do try to do that. Still in touch with Mizuguchi-san pretty sporadically, but you know, we do talk once in a while. I see him sometimes when he comes to the States. I actually technically live in San Francisco until the pandemic hit, and then I kind of came back to help family out in large part. And then when the lockdown started, I said, well, I'll just stay down here for a while. My girlfriend's still up in San Francisco, and I might move back up there by the end of the year, or at some point next year once they kind of reopen the office. But yeah, I try to keep in touch with folks. And what was I going to? There's something about San Francisco I was going to mention. Oh, yeah, that Mizuguchi-san would come sometimes to the Game Developers Conference. Yes. And so I'd get together with him there. And speaking of him, there's another guy. This is kind of a little bit of a side story, but kind of in line with keeping connections and helping other people out, and then, like, you know, staying in touch with folks down the road. So there was a guy, when I came back to work at Alias Wavefront in San Francisco, we kind of handled the whole western seaboard of the country. And so I'd go up to Washington State as well. And I went to Boss Games once.
Oh, yeah.
I went to help out an artist there with Maya. It's like helping like some demo and kind of doing some one-on-one work with Maya. And I noticed he had all these like Japanese books on his desk, like magazines and books, sci-fi stuff and modeling stuff and whatnot, anime. And I said, oh, you're interested in Japan? He goes, oh, yeah. I think he said he lived in Osaka for a summer or something like that. And he said, so I started telling him, actually, I lived there. I worked here. I worked there. I worked at Sega. He's like, you worked at Sega? He goes, did you know Mizuguchi-san? I go, yeah, he was my boss there. He goes, oh my God. He got so excited. I remember that. So he said, like, my dream is to work for Mizuguchi-san in Japan, you know? And I said, well, maybe I can help out with that. So I actually got the two in touch, introduced them, you know, virtually, and got them in touch. And I think that they ended up meeting at another GDC or something. This was probably in like 98 or 99, something like that. And then Mizuguchi-san hired him. So that guy, his name is Jake Kasdal. He went and ended up living in Japan. And I think he ended up living there longer than I did. Then he came back to the States and he was here for a while. And then he moved back. And now he has his own games company that's in Kyoto. And so he's been there already for, I don't know, almost 10 years there with his wife and kids. And so I visited him once there in a trip I made to Japan, maybe like 6 years ago or something. But I've seen him a few times over the years, and also at GDC, he was there as well with Mizuguchi-san. I mean, they don't work together anymore directly, but they kind of, you know, everyone gets together for this kind of industry party and whatnot. So that's fun. So it's kind of nice to have played a part in his career, and he's done really well for himself. And he's doing VR games now as well. He came out with one called, what was it called? Smoking, something with the word smoke. He gave me a free copy, which was awesome. And I've only gotten through a certain part in it, and I got busy with some other things, but I have the Quest 2 headset, so I pop that on every once in a while and play around.
That's wonderful. Yeah, I know Mizuguchi, like, I read in interviews that, like, working on Sega Rally, and then he did Sega Touring Car Championship and Manx TT with AM3, and then he was like, I really didn't have much of a desire to continue working on racing games or stuff in that sort of environment. He was always very motivated, it seemed, by like the audio visual connection and synesthesia and all of these things, and kind of making that into like puzzle games, Luminous, and of course Tetris Effect now. And he is
another one.
Yeah, Rez too, absolutely. It's probably that's like the foremost.
Jake worked on Rez with Mizuguchi-san. I think that was the main game they worked on together. But yeah, he was, even when I was at Sega, he was big on, like, you know, the crossroads of audio and visual. So there was always this talk about having visuals respond to audio. And even the other person, Uryu-san, that I mentioned that I had met together with Mizuguchi-san originally, I think he was also kind of interested in that, in developing something along those lines. and great for me. I mean, I would have loved to join in on that project or that type of a project because of my love of audio as well, but it didn't happen while I was there.
Yeah, there's so many projects going on at any one time. I imagine it's like it can be hard to choose, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. So with Sega Rally Championship, did you like how much of the final product did you like play it in the arcades? Are you very familiar with the game? Is it something that you've like appreciated after the fact? You know?
Honestly, I didn't really play it much because I'm just not into car racing, to be honest.
Gotcha.
Sure.
But I played it here and there for fun. I probably played it more in the company than I did actually out at arcades. But it was just definitely fun to have been part of. I remember also chatting a lot with there's a guy named Sasaki was his last name.
Kenji Sasaki, I think.
Kenji, I think, yeah.
And
his girlfriend at the time, I think they got married later. I'm trying to remember her name now. Why am I spacing? But the two of them were closely together. And I think maybe they were together at another company before Sega as well. But anyway, so he actually introduced me to a software that later on I ended up using in a new incarnation. So are you familiar with the software called Houdini?
I've heard of it.
No.
Okay, it's another 3D animation and rendering software package, but it's all based on procedural workflows, and it's node-based, whereas Maya is not really node-based. It's kind of just object-based in the scene view. So working on something procedurally means you can go back in the stack and change anything along the way, and everything gets updated from that point down. You don't have to, delete everything you did and start over, essentially. Sure. So the predecessor to Houdini was called Prisms, and Sasaki-san, he introduced me, or he showed me what he was doing with Prisms. They were using it to basically generate the racetracks in a rally.
Oh.
And so that way they could go back and just redefine the initial curve, and based on that curve, they'll extrude the curve out. And so instead of having to rebuild it all from scratch, they could very easily make any changes they needed to the racetracks and stuff. So I remember that was really cool to see. That was a different kind of methodology to modeling and stuff than I was used to at that point in Soft Image and in the Alias products. And that kind of made a lot of sense to me. And then the other guy, I think his last name was Yamamoto, and he was the key software lead on it. So he was writing all the game code. So because I was a programmer, I didn't really know anything about how to program games. It's all event driven and whatnot. But so I remember he would kind of show me, I'd ask him some questions. He would show me bits of the code. So I thought that was fun as well. All these people start to come back to mind. Oh yeah, there was Ono-san and I forgot there were a few other people in there. And then, of course, Ogichi-san, who became president of the whole company later.
I was going to ask you. Well, Brendan, you had wanted to ask which of the two cars you prefer, because they're the famous two cars in the game. There's the Lancia Delta, which is like the hatchback, and then Toyota Celica is the green and red one.
For me, it's like I'm not that into cars, but the main one that's on the shirt. Is that
that's the Celica, I think.
That's the...
Oh, they're both there, but the
both
Celica's in the front, yeah.
I'm trying to remember. The white one, I guess I prefer the one that's closer to us. That's the main one I just remember from the advertising.
Gotcha.
But as far as the cars themselves, I wasn't really that much into cars, which reminds me that all these years later, I decided I haven't owned a car myself for like the last 7 or 8 years now, just because I've lived in places where you can use Uber and Lyft. I can bike to work and that kind of thing. But now in my latest current situation, I really need a car again. So I put in an order for an EV. I think I'm going to get an electric car. Okay. And so I finally decided on the Volkswagen ID4, and I put in my initial order for it. But I'm still sitting here probably like 2.5, 3 months later, and I had only one update, and that's it. I still have no idea when I'm going to get that. So
the market is horrible. It's horrible. You put in an order, and then you're waiting like half a yeyear. Yeah, it's happened to everybody I know.
It's just not the right time for that.
Yeah.
You had mentioned that you're the friend who worked on AR and VR projects, and I saw that you do some development of that as well. Is that Lucasfilm or just a hobby thing, or?
But that was separate from Lucasfilm. So at Lucasfilm, I work I'm a senior pipeline technical director, or TD, So I'm also doing software tools. Like basically, when my career after Alias Wavefront, I got into visual effects proper, and the first film I worked on was the first Shrek animated movie.
Ah.
Oh, cool.
So that was my actual first film credit. So again, it was like a nice kind of film to have worked on. And then I worked on a number of films that are like parts of different trilogies and franchises since then. And then finally, after many, many years of not having any chance to work on Star Wars or Star Trek, which I grew up watching both of those, the last gig I had in LA was working at Bad Robot. And I got to work on Episode 7 and then Star Trek Beyond back to back at that company.
Wow.
And and the other thing is nice, like over the course of working all these companies, when you're done with projects, we would definitely or usually get posters and have all the other, your coworkers and stuff sign them. Sometimes you could get the director to sign it and whatnot. So I got a bunch of posters in the other room I'm going to finally put up on these walls here. But I have this one. This is the latest one I got from a few years back, and J.J. Abrams signed it for me, which was nice because it was his company. So he's just around the company, and he was nice enough to sign it. That company was awesome. You could spend a whole nother podcast just talking about how cool working for Bad Robot was. But yeah, so I just wondering what else you guys might want to know about Sega. But one other thing that I do remember is, in addition to the folks that came from Soft Image to do that proprietary development, there was another company, because we're just talking about AR and VR and whatnot. I think it was called Virtuality. It was either Virtuosity or Virtuality. They were from England. And they sent, I think it was 3 guys came over. And just like the guys from Soft Image, they were there for like, I don't know, months, maybe 3 or 4 months.
Yeah.
And they came to work in AM3, whereas the Soft Image guys, they came and they were stationed in AM2, but I would kind of interface with them. Hmm. So one of the 3 guys that came from England, he was like, he looked like a rock, like a, heavy metal rock dude, and he had this long blonde hair and his like skin tight, like leather pants or whatever, studs on him and all this kind of stuff. But those guys were really fun. And the thing that was funny, I remember that they had a monthly stipend. And if they didn't go through it all that month, it wouldn't be replenished for the next month. So they made sure to spend all the money in the account every month. And how did they do that? Those guys drank like fish. And so, of course, they and I don't know how they did it. But I mean, we were all a lot younger, but literally those guys would be out like all night, especially this one guy, and just like come back to work the next morning, and like days in a row. I don't even know, no sleep maybe. But they'd often invite us to come out. So there were certain areas of Tokyo that were fun for that kind of thing, for food, but also like all these really cool little, like, niche bars and things. And we would just stick with those guys, and they would pay for it all because they had to spend all the money. But they were working with us. They were co-developing a virtual reality game for the arcade, and it had a headset, everything. So I remember seeing that in development, but I don't remember what that game was called or how popular it became.
Trying to think if anything comes off the top of my head that perhaps around about that time period it could have been, but I can't really think. The only thing I was going to say about your story, Ken, was that I think the old itemless receipt technique for work tabs always goes down a treat. If you're spending your money on drinks, you don't want that to show up on the receipt, of course.
Right.
It was dinner.
I don't know how.
Yeah,
Yeah, exactly. They knew what they were doing. I'll tell you that.
Mm. Yeah. Well, wow. Yeah.
I have one other story I can think of I could tell you before we wrap up and all that.
Please do. Yeah, we got time. I don't know where it
all right.
The stories are great. I could honestly sit here all day.
Well, this is kind of a fun one for me. So I mentioned this friend of mine, Jeff. So his last name is Buchanan. So he used to be in the Marine Corps, and he fought in the Gulf War, and he was injured there, and he left the military after being injured there, right? And then his wife was Japanese, and anyway, so he loved Japan. I mean, he's very well studied. I mean, he was Marines and all that, so he knows combat and whatnot, but very well read and studied, and he's like a brother basically. We got really close, and I told you we've kept in touch all these years, and like I spoke to him just a few days ago. He's in Virginia now, again, where he's from originally. But anyway, so we do a lot. Like he'd say, hey, okay, let's work out. So, he knew like how to do all the workout stuff. So I remember like we had a period where we'd go out like every morning, run around, starting from the company and end up doing push-ups and all this kind of stuff. But we used to have a lot of fun in the company because there's certain games in the arcade that I used to go to the arcades and play these games, but I'd play some other competitors' games. Remember, there's one by Namco. It was called Cyber Tank, I think, or Cyber Tanks or something. Cyber Sled. That was it.
Yeah.
I used to love that game because it was these vehicles you could sit in, you could play against somebody else. So you either had like the slow but well armored one, or you had the really speedy but less decked out craft. And so I used to play the speedy one, and that friend of mine, Jeff, he'd play the other one often. But they had this at Sega because they had a lot of competitors' games there in the hallways and whatnot.
Sure.
So, and then of course they had like their own games, like the Virtua Fighter games, like they're developing the second one or the third one. And so I think it was that time, the first one was out there working on version 2, and that added, what was the name of the drunken fighter guy?
Is it Shun D? I think
something
Shun
like
the name,
or
Shun
something.
D.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I ended up liking that character. In the first game, I really liked Kage. He was the ninja,
Mm-hmm.
And I learned some interesting Japanese from the things he would say in the game. And I asked, what is he saying there? Oh, okay, that's cool. But anyway, so Jeff and I would often, we'd establish this kind of pattern of living and working. He had his own family, but he had to commute quite a distance. Whereas for me, the commute wasn't quite as bad, and I didn't have any family to go home to. Just a girlfriend, but I didn't have kids or whatnot. But anyway, but he would often stay over at the company because he'd work too late or whatever, and didn't want to go all the way home and back. So this would happen fairly often, maybe once a week, once every other week, something like that. We'd finish the workday and then we'd go and eat. There were a number of restaurants right around the company. I mean, we go to these restaurants for lunch too, but there was one that we typically go to for dinner, and they used to make like, tonkatsu. You're familiar with what that is? The food. It's like fried cutlet. And
yes. Yeah.
Like pork cutlet, sometimes, or chicken cutlet. And they can either have it just like that, or they'll do different things, put different ingredients on it. Mm-hmm. So I remember we used to call this place, I think Jeff came up with the name for it. They called it the Cheesy Chicken Place. And because they would make this kind of cutlet, but they would they would layer the chicken with cheese in it, and then they'd fry it, and you'd have rice and veggies and whatnot with it. So we'd often go there and eat dinner. And then we'd head back to the company, and of course after we finished work. So then we'd just start playing these different games for hours, and then we'd be done around midnight or something. And we had just like today, a lot of companies, even like I have at Lucasfilm, we had like your security card, and we figured out the system because you had to tap the card on the reader to log your hours at work. And so we figured out the system that we would tag off at a certain time. I don't know, it was like 6:45 p.m. or something like that, or maybe 6 or 5. I don't remember. But I remember in the morning, we finally figured out that the work day started like at 6:45 a.m. And so we'd go and we'd sleep in the motion capture room. And this was the room where they did all the motion capture for the Virtua Fighter games, among other things. And Jeff was actually hired because of his Marine hand-to-hand combat experience. So he ended up becoming an animator on the team using Softimage, but his main contribution was to help come up with some of the moves, the hand-to-hand combat moves, to make sure they were realistic. And actually, one of the characters in Virtua Fighter is named after him. So there's a character named Jeffrey, he's like the big Caribbean guy.
Yeah.
So that's named after him. So anyway, so we'd sleep in this motion capture room, and then we'd make sure to wake up in the morning in time. We'd get out, wash my face or whatever, and then swipe the card right at 6:45 a.m. Go down to this place called Jonathan's, and there was that and another place for breakfast because they had like the all-you-can-eat omelet breakfast deal with coffee and all that. And then come back to the company, and we had like another hour and a half of gameplay before we had to be back at our desk to start another workday. So those were good times.
Yeah,
that sounds like the perfect work-life balance. I love everything about that.
Yeah,
it does.
It was in your 20s,
Yeah.
Not in my age.
Yeah, I believe because you had mentioned Kenji Sasaki. I believe he either came over from Namco or went to Namco after, because I think he worked on Ridge Racer.
Could be.
So yeah, it might have been Ridge Racer to Sega Rally.
And I think his girlfriend, and then perhaps later his wife's name was Shoji. I think Shoji-san. if I remember correctly. But that reminds me, I don't remember it being Sasaki-san, but there was a group of people that's for racing stuff, but there was a group of people in AM2 working on the Virtual Fighter stuff that all the other companies wanted to create something similar. And I remember those guys almost as a group, they would go and work at another company like Capcom and then go to Namco or whatever. And at each company they went to, they would develop a similar game to Virtual Fighter, with all the same kind of mechanics, 3D mechanics and stuff. And I just remember like hearing that each time they went, they would just negotiate a higher salary. So they'd just be getting more money and more money every company they went to.
Also, you have to hire us as a group. We're a consolidated unit. Yeah.
Seemed like that's what they were doing. Yeah, it's all or nothing. Yeah.
Very smart.
Yeah.
Wow. So yeah, the time's just flown by. We're at about an hour and a half.
Okay.
I guess we can kind of start winding down. But Brent, any last questions for Ken here? Any closing thoughts?
No, I mean, no burning questions, Ken. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. It's like I said, it sounds really silly, but you'd be surprised at how much credence things like announcers can have in people's memories, just from that audio part you were talking about earlier. There was a really apparent story that happened on the internet about a year ago for the announcer for another Sega game called Super Monkey Ball, and basically there was this YouTuber who really loved the series and started like a literal almost manhunt to find the guy who'd done the announcers for this game because he wasn't listed in the credits or that sort of thing. And it went like semi-viral, just trying to find this guy who'd simply said things like finish and goal and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So whilst you haven't been the suspect of a manhunt yourself, you'll be happy to know that it is very possible that the types of work that you've done in these games can really resonate with people, and like that's always the thing that sticks out to me when I think about Sega Rally. It's not just the music, it's the announcer voice as well, and like you were saying earlier about Mizuguchi-san, like he was a guy who really liked the idea of audio and visual matching up. So he must have absolutely known that your voice was like the absolute perfect thing for the game, and there was no need to look for anybody else.
Yeah, no, it all just, it all worked out really well, and I'm really appreciative of the fact that people really enjoyed it, because it's the kind of story I hear from other people, like let's say Mark Hamill when he talks about his time on Star Wars. He's got so many stories, but he's got certain stories he tells again and again, and he's just like, we had no idea it was going to be popular at the time, and we all thought that would be it, and they didn't really spend much time this, that, and the other. Then it becomes this big deal, and people are asking him all these different questions, and now he's got, on Twitter, he's got his own account there, and I follow on there just to see what he comes up with. But it's interesting that the impact certain things will have, or just like something's part of the, your memory and the whole persona of some, piece of media that it's just great to have been a part of it. You don't realize what it might become someday to certain people. So I'm happy that it's done good things for folks.
Yeah, I mean, we also have to recognize that this was the early to mid 90s. Like, I remember it was a big deal anytime any video game had speech in it. It was just not something you were guaranteed to encounter. So the idea of playing this racing game that looked really good, that played amazingly, that had all this great music, and then somebody was talking at me, it felt like there was a presence there that maybe other games lacked. And in rallying, especially like as a simulation, like the role of the co-driver is very important. It's the entire sport revolves around, because while in Sega Rally, obviously you're doing the same stages, you're doing the same tracks, and you can remember those tracks after you've played them a couple times. In rallying, the stages are numerous and very long, and they change year to year, and there's no way the driver is going to know what lies ahead. So, so your involvement was also key. I can't say for certain like what was the first racing game to have co-driver calls in it, but I mean Sega Rally I think is definitely the one that most people would say made it mainstream.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I wasn't aware of the kind of history of that, but that's interesting. Yeah, and it's also interesting that you always refer to as the co-driver, because I always remember it being referred to as the navigator.
The navigator,
yeah.
They're both. I mean, they both work.
Yeah, I just don't know that industry to know what the terminology is.
Yeah, typically the calls would be like you would do like maybe the radius of the corner. So if it was a 90 return, to be like 90 right, and then or you might do like you'd say over crest, like you say over jump in the game, or like a decreasing, like you'd attach a number to a call, and that would tell you how tight the corner is going to be. So if it was like a 1, that would be tighter than like a 6, for example. So
got it.
Yeah, and it's
short
like
code words that get the idea across,
Right, and they've actually hired like real co-drivers to do in some of these really super realistic simulations they have today for these games. Like Dirt Rally is a big one. They hire actual co-drivers and they put them. I think they put them in I can't remember the name of the guy who does it, Brendan, or who did it for Dirt Rally 2. But they put him in like a motion rig, and they put the headset on him, and that was actually like the kind of headset he would be using if he was in the car, and he's getting like jostled around and like beaten up and down and stuff by this motion rig, and they have him record the line so it sounds authentic. Wow, the lengths they go to for an authentic game. That's
cool though. I mean, if I were a rally racing enthusiast, I'd be all over that.
I don't get the sense you'd want to put yourself in that machine and go through that.
No, to play the result of it.
Well, listen, Ken, it's been absolutely fantastic. We both of us obviously cannot thank you enough for taking the time to be here, talking about all your memories, and it was amazing. It was a formative part, obviously, of our lives and so many people to play these games, but then to hear the stories behind them is just is especially really nice. So thanks.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate you taking the time and the interest, all these years later, to be interviewed for the first time for this. It's an honor and a pleasure to do this. So thanks, guys.
There's actually like one thing we were going to ask you, Ken. It depends, of course. Depends, of course, how good the pipes are these days. Do you think you could try and replicate the voice and say Time Extend Racing Game Podcast? That you did that voice so many years ago?
I could try. What is the line again?
Time Extend Racing Game Podcast.
All right, let's see. Time Extend Racing Game Podcast.
Oh man,
I think that was perfect.
That's a 10 out of 10 from me.
You didn't need a maybe on that one. That was pretty much for sure.
That was one take. Now I know why Mizuguchi-san was like, right, that's who we're going with. You don't need a second take. Is there anything? We're not. We have a little niche community. We're not super big, but are you active on social media? Would you like to plug anything? Space is yours.
I'm not huge on social media.
Okay.
I'm basically in my generation, I guess we got into Facebook. I know the younger folks are more on Instagram. I'm also on Instagram and on Twitter a little bit, but not too much on Twitter. But I don't know that I have anything really to push. I just want to thank everybody who's had the interest over the years and hopefully all aspects of the Sega Rally game. And I have to say, kudos to the programmers and all the people who put all the effort into actually making it work, other than just people contributing voices and whatnot. It's kind of like my career for the last 20 plus years as a visual effects artist. It's always nice when people are up on stage, like a director or one of the actors will actually recognize all the people in visual effects, all the animators, the effects animators, the models. I mean, all these people who put all this time and energy to producing stuff that's oftentimes an actual real character in the film that would never be shown up on stage, really. So it's always, always like to thank all the people who put time and energy into things. And then all the fans, I guess I can say. It's interesting to have a fan base for the game, but I'm glad there is one.
Of course. And we all thank you.
I will plug one thing.
Yes.
So I'm currently, I work on an animated episodic Star Wars program on Disney Plus called The Bad Batch. So please, if you haven't already, watch The Bad Batch. Season 2 is going to come out, I think they announced it'll be in September. And then there was another kind of secret project we were working on, which they did announce at the Star Wars Celebration recently, called Tales of the Jedi. So that's another one that I've been working on. So that's something to look forward to. So go get your Star Wars on.
I'll be sure to look out for that. I will admit, I am somehow like I don't know how I just missed Star Wars like my whole life. I'm like the only the only person. Yeah. So like my girlfriend actually she's very into Star Wars, and we watched the episode. She was like, is it okay if I just watch this one episode of the Boba Fett show where the Mandalorian shows up? And I was like, okay, I don't know what any of those things mean, but sure, let's watch it. And the episode, spoiler, we don't usually have to warn about spoilers for Star Wars, but spoilers for anyone who hasn't seen the episode. The whole episode is just the Mandalorian. I don't think Boba Fett appears in it at all. So when the episode starts, it's like the first 5 minutes, like I guess if you would call it like the pre-credit sequence, and then the title goes up on the screen, and it's all the Mandalorian. I turned to my girlfriend, I'm like, that's cool. So when does the Mandalorian show up? That was Fett, him. Yeah. You've seen him. Yeah, you've seen him. And I'm like, but this is the Boba Fett show. I was very confused.
Yeah, it is interesting how they did that. But I think later they explained it, just like in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, they're trying to have all these series that take place in the same time frame. In the Star Wars universe, have characters intercrossing, and eventually they'll all come together in some way or another.
Sure.
So, yeah, that's what my current boss, Dave Filoni, is working on, the new Ahsoka series, and he was involved with Mandalorian and to some degree Boba Fett, I think. And so he's he's like kind of at the core of making all this happen in these different series. So
very cool. I'll be sure to look out for the Bad Batch and deepen my Star Wars knowledge for the next time.
Same here.
All right. It's been a pleasure chatting with the two of you.
It's been a pleasure. It's been a pleasure here as well. Thank you so much. And thanks, everybody.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
Cheers.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Sega Rally Championship.